Hi there. Let's take a look at a couple of terms and concepts that are related to external growth that may come up in your exams: horizontal and vertical integration. Now, I've mentioned that these terms are usually made in connection with trying to explain the reasons why firms engage in external growth, such as takeovers and mergers. And whilst it's a relatively important concept, it's important to keep it fairly simple. So in terms of the direction of integration as a result of these external growth strategies, the first thing to remember is that there is a possibility of going in a vertical direction, either forward integration, or backward integration, and the alternative is to go from side to side, what's known as horizontal integration. Now, to understand the nature of these terms, the important thing is just to reflect on what happens in what's known as the supply chain in a business. Let's look at a simple example of a supply chain. This will help us explain these concepts of integration. A supply chain might be a simple one like this. You've got businesses involved in the supply of raw materials. Those raw materials may then be put into a manufacturing process. The output from a manufacturing process might then go to distributors, and those distributors in turn are likely to pass the finished goods onto retailers, and of course then onto final consumers like you and I. That is an example of the supply chain working from left to right, from raw materials to manufacturing, onto the distributor, and finally onto the retailers. And in terms of integration, a business may decide to try to move up the supply chain or forward. Of course, it could also move down the supply chain or backwards. So in terms of takeovers, these terms, let's just quickly define what they mean and then give you a couple of examples to illustrate them. In terms of forward integration, what we're looking at there is moving up, moving forward through the supply chain. For example, a manufacturer deciding to buy a distributor of its products. We've seen that in a supply chain you can go backwards. So backwards integration, vertical integration, involves a business moving earlier in the supply chain. For example, a retailer buying a wholesaler, or a manufacturing business buying a supplier of raw materials. And we've mentioned that you can also go from side to side. A horizontal integration strategy involves buying a business that is operating at the same stage of the supply chain. For example, a manufacturer buying another manufacturer, a retailer buying a retailer. There is one fourth direction of integration which we're not going to cover in this video. We'll do a separate video on diversification, where the takeover or the merger has no connection with the business and the supply chain. It's in an entirely different industry. It's called diversification or conglomerate integration, and as I say, we'll deal with that one in a separate video. Well, hopefully that's helped set the scene in terms of these different types of term. Let's have a look at a couple of examples just to help illustrate them. Forward integration. Here's a takeover that took place in 2016, and it involved a business called the Booker Group. The Booker Group is one of the UK's largest wholesalers. Runs a bit like Costco, well, very much like Costco, runs large wholesale operations which serve individuals, but mainly small retailers. And what the Booker Group did was it agreed a takeover of a very large chain of convenience stores, a retail business called Londis and Budgens, over 2,000 stores there. That was an example of a distributor acquiring a retailer, in other words, moving up or forward up the supply chain, forward integration. Here's an example of backwards integration. The business on the right you'll certainly be familiar with, IKEA, one of the world's largest an iconic global retailer of furniture and household goods. And what IKEA did in 2016 was to make a significant purchase of forests and their associated equipment, the wood cutters and collectors in Romania and Bulgaria. And what it was doing, it's wanting to ensure that its manufacturing business had access to raw materials, so it was moving back into the supply chain. An example of backwards integration. And finally, here's an example of horizontal integration. There are lots of these. You'll often see retailers buying other retailers. In this case, this was one of the world's largest hotel businesses, Marriott. buying a business called Starwood Hotels, which includes a whole bunch of brands, including Sheraton Hotels. And as a result of that takeover, which was finally approved in 2016, Marriott became the world's largest hotel chain. A classic example of a horizontal integration where you've got a retail or service business buying a very close competitor. So there we go. That's an overview of these concepts called horizontal and vertical integration.